Welcome back to Old Book Time Traveler. You're here with me, OB. We're going to resume reading our story. Actually, it's not really a story, is it now? We're reading out of A Pictorial History of the United States. And let's start where we left off last time. We're in Chapter 5, Discovery of America by the Northmen. Now, excuse me for if I mispronounce any words through here, and keep in mind that some of these pages do have some damage as far as the smoke, so there are times when it's hard to read what they're saying. But come along as we travel back in time through the start of Discovery of America by the Northmen. Before we proceed to speak of Columbus, we must say a few words respecting the accounts of the discovery of America. Previous to his time, the Welsh have a tradition of some celebrity, according to which a chieftain of Wales named Mado made several distant voyages to the west about the year 1170. In one of these expeditions, they say that he discovered a fair and large country, and returning to Wales, took with him a number of his friends and relatives, and set forth to settle there. From this period, there was never anything heard of them. It has been thought that the fair and large country was America, and that these immigrants went thither. But there is no good reason to believe this. The discovery of America by the Northmen at an earlier period rests on surer foundation. The inhabitants of Norway and Denmark were by far the most adventurous seamen of Europe during the Middle Ages. As early as the year 860, they had discovered Iceland, and it was colonized by the Norwegians in 874. Greenland was discovered not long after and was settled by two colonies, one from Denmark and one from Norway. The intercourse between this place and the home country became, therefore, common. According to well-authenticated accounts, in the year 1002, Leif, a Norwegian with a number of men, set sail from Greenland and proceeded southwestward. They soon came to a land, and continuing their voyage, discovered a country of grapes, which they named Vinland, or the land of wine. The party returned to Greenland, but not soon after, Thorwald pursued the discovery in the same ship. Having landed on a beautiful shore, he fell in with the savages and was killed by them. His party escaped and returned to Greenland, whence still other expeditions were sent to the newly discovered country. Though the accounts of these voyages are somewhat vague, there is no good reason to doubt that these Northmen actually discovered the coast of New England, and for some time were in the habit of making voyages thither. Cape Cod, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and other places are described in their accounts too accurately to admit of serious doubt as to their identity. The knowledge of Vinland, however, appears not to have been generally communicated to Europe, and it was finally lost to the Northmen themselves. After the year 1120, we hear nothing of it in their annuals, and all traces of such a country were entirely obliterated from the minds of mankind. At the period of Columbus, the existence of America was as complete a secret as if the hardy Norwegians had never plowed those northern seas. Chapter 6, Account of Columbus. And this is showing a portrait of Columbus. It says, "This western world was discovered by Christopher Columbus, as we have already said, about 350 years ago. How surprising the changes which have taken place in this comparatively short period. Instead of a mere wilderness, or best an abode of savages, much of the continent is now peopled by civilized men and thickly studded with cities, towns, and villages. Columbus was a native of Genoa in Italy and was born A.D. 1435. He was chiefly employed, till he was 14 years of age, with his father in combing wool. He was exceedingly fond of books, but the circumstances of his father did not allow him to indulge in his natural fondness for them. He was particularly pleased with books of voyages and travels, and early manifested a desire to see foreign countries. At length he was allowed to go to sea. His first voyages were in the Mediterranean. Of these we know little Of these we know but little. We know that he was employed for a time in a war between the Venetians and the Mohammedans, and that in one instance, when the vessel to which he belonged had taken fire, he saved his life by swimming. But Columbus was too active and enterprising to be always confined to the narrow limits of the Mediterranean. He traveled to almost every part of the world which was then known, and his practical mind at length led him to contemplate a journey to parts which as yet had not been even thought of by most persons. The mariners of the 15th century knew little of foreign countries. Their knowledge was chiefly confined to the coasts and islands of Europe. They had never ventured so far along the shores of Africa as to cross the equator. The trade with the East Indies was at the time carried on by land, and the West Indies were of course undiscovered. The strong desire which was felt by commercial men to find out a path to the East Indies by water led to much conversation on the subject, and some persons began to think and speak of the probability of reaching that part of the world by sailing round the southern point of Africa. But Columbus had a plan which extended still farther. Having learned from books of geography and astronomy that the earth was round, it very naturally occurred to him that there might be more land somewhere to counterpose what was already known on one side of the globe, and that it was at least quite possible to find the East Indies by sailing westward. But what was to be done? He and his friends were poor, and it would require much money to fit out an expedition like that which the prosecution of his schemes would demand. He was therefore compelled to seek the patronage and pecuniary aid of others. He first explained his views and stated his plans to the Senate of his native country, Genoa, and subsequently to the King of Portugal and the King and Queen of Spain. They heard him with patience, but believing him to be somewhat visionary, were not disposed to afford him the necessary aid. Still, he was not discouraged. He had by this time drawn into his service his two younger brothers, Bartholomew and Diego. Bartholomew had even been sent to England to solicit aid from Henry VII. But the vessel in which he was taken by pirates, and nothing more was heard for some time either of him or his undertakings. In the meantime, the appeal to the King and Queen of Spain had been renewed, and after the lapse of about 8 years it succeeded. Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to furnish 3 small vessels and 90 men and provisions for 1 year. Such an outfit was thought exceedingly liberal, and Queen Isabella even parted with her jewels to pay the expenses. The names of the 3 vessels that thus sailed to America were the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. The latter 2 were mere barks, but the Santa Maria, or Columbus's own vessel, was of considerable size. In addition to a crew of 90 men, about 30 other persons went out with them as mere adventurers. Chapter 7. First discovery of America by Columbus, and it says here, Indians looking at vessels of Columbus as they approached. Columbus was now not far from 55 years of age. He had spent 40 years at sea and nearly 20 in planning this western voyage. The day of his setting sail must have been a proud one for him. How must his strong heart have beat high with emotion. The little fleet left Palos in Spain on the morning of August 13th, 1492. Their course was southwestward till they reached the Canary Islands, after which they proceeded exactly west. They had a good deal of unfavorable weather and were 40 days in reaching the West Indies. The seamen grew tired of the voyage and once became mutinous. Columbus thought an old commander was greatly troubled with them, but he contrived in one way or another to keep them from open rebellion. At length, on the 21st of October, they faintly discovered land, and on the 22nd they were alongside of a beautiful green island. This proved to be Guyana of the Bahamas, but Columbus named it St. Salvador. It was several leagues in extent and had inhabitants upon it. Columbus, who had been the first to discover, and the night before was the first to go ashore in the morning. As soon as he landed, he knelt and kissed the earth, at the same time thanking God, who had prospered their enterprise. His men, impatient and mutinous as they had been during the voyage, now crowded around him and begged for his forgiveness. The scene must have been truly affecting. The native inhabitants of the island, naked, copper-colored, with long black hair and without beards, gathered around the newcomers, not knowing what to make of them. They looked at the ships with even greater amazement than at the men, regarding them, it is supposed, as another species of animal, and when some guns were discharged, they thought they had eyes of fire and voices of thunder. When Columbus had spent a little time in examining the new island, he proceeded to make farther discoveries. Cuba was seen November 7th, and Hispaniola, or St. Domingo, not long afterwards. These, however, were all the lands which were discovered during this first voyage. As Columbus supposed these to be part of the Indies, they left afterwards, acquired the name of the West Indies. Columbus set out on his return to Spain January 14th, 1493. On their passage homeward, the adventurers encountered terrible storms, in one of which they were near but lost. In the moment of the greatest danger, Columbus had presence of mind enough to write on parchment a short account of his voyage, enclose it in a cake of wax, and commit it to the sea in the cask, in hopes that if all else should be lost, this might survive. After 70 days, however, they arrived safe in Spain. A second voyage was made in the fall of 1493, during which Columbus discovered Jamaica and a few other islands, but now unexpected difficulties occurred. Enemies thickened around him and retarded his progress. It was not till the summer of 1498 that he made his third voyage, during which he discovered the continent to which he had been the first to open a pathway. Even then, being charged with misconduct, he was carried home in irons. Columbus was, however, liberated and made a fourth voyage to America in 1502 with his brother Bartholomew and his son Ferdinand, but it was his last. The same enmity which had caused him to be sent home from his third voyage in fetters still raged, and he at last became its victim. After languishing in obscurity and poverty for a time, he died in Valladolid in Spain, May 30, 1506, in the 70th year of his age. The new continent, on every just principle, should have been called Columbia after its first discoverer, but one Americus Vespucius, a Florentine, who visited the continent in 1499, contrived to have it called his own name instead of that of Columbus. Chapter 8. Other Discoveries in America. The fame of what Columbus had done was soon spread through Europe, and adventurers flocked to the New World, some for honor, some for expertise, and others for gain. In general, however, the great object of pursuit was gold and other precious commodities, as will become more evident in the progress of our history. Two Englishmen, John Cabot and Sebastian his son, were the first discoverers of the continent of America. They sailed in May 1497 under the patronage of Henry VII of England. They saw the continent a year sooner than Columbus, and 2 years before Americus Vespucius. In this and subsequent voyages they also discovered the islands of Newfoundland and St. John, and coasted as far south as Virginia, claiming the country in behalf of the King of England by virtue of these discoveries. In 1501, the King of Portugal sent out a fleet of discovery under the command of Gaspar Cortrial. He sailed along the shores of North America 600 or 700 miles, but he appears to have thought more of money than anything else, and not finding gold, he seized on 50 of the native Indians, carrying them home and sold them as slaves. Emboldened by his success, he made a second voyage, but did not live to return. The general belief is that he lost his life in attempting to secure another cargo of slaves, and that Labrador was the theater of his crime and its punishment. This, however, is not quite certain. The French, too, engaged in attempts to make discoveries. What they did, however, was at first principally about the mouth of the St. Lawrence and the islands of Newfoundland and Cape Breton. By the year 1505 or 1506, they were quite familiar with these regions, and Denis of Honfleur had drawn a map of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. As early as 1508, the French had become much engaged in the fisheries on the northeast coast of the present United States, and as if to follow up the wicked example of the Portuguese and involve the first settlers in cruel wars, had carried away to France some of the natives. They appear also to have mediated the establishment of colonies in the New World. This is on to Chapter 9, Discoveries in North America, and it says here the death of Ponce De Leon. One of the most remarkable voyages of discovery was made in 1524. Francis I, King of France, sent out to America one Verrazzi, a Florentine, who was with a single vessel, the Dolphin. After a long voyage of 50 days and terrible storm, reached North Carolina, whence, sailing northward, he explored the coasts of New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nova Scotia, and returned to France. He also paid some attention to the coasts of Florida. In 1534, the same king sent James Cartier to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Newfoundland. In a second voyage, this navigator sailed up the St. Lawrence as far as Montreal, to which he gave its present name. He also learned of the Indians, something of the northern New York and Vermont. He claimed possession of Canada in behalf of the French. Though the French were early attracted to Florida, the Spaniards were before them. Ponce de Leon, a voyager with Columbus, having come disaffected toward him, proceeded from Puerto Rico in March 1512 to make discoveries by himself. He found a new region on the 6th of April, to which he gave the name of Florida on account of its florid or blooming appearance. The King of Spain, in whose name Leon claimed the country, appointed him the governor of it, on condition of him establishing a colony there. In attempting to effect a settlement, he met with many remarkable adventures, and finally his people were attacked by the Indians and driven away, as he was himself mortally wounded. In 1520, 2 slave ships were fitted out at St. Domingo, which proceeded to the coast of South Carolina, and having decoyed the native Indians on board, suddenly set sail and carried them to St. Domingo. It is not surprising that the savages of the continent, from one end of it to the other, became suspicious of white men. In 1540, Ferdinand De Soto made a tour through Florida northward to Georgia, and thence westward across the Cherokee country in Alabama to the country of the Chickasaws, where he spent the winter. In the spring of 1541, he discovered and crossed the Mississippi and traveled in Arkansas and Missouri. He died in 1542, and his companions passed through Louisiana to Mexico. The details of this expedition are full of interest. The Indians of these regions at this period were numerous, and their manners and customs present much that is curious. This is Sir Walter Raleigh. We have already seen that the English, through the Cabots, had established large claims in the new continent. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth sent out the celebrated and accomplished Sir Walter Raleigh on a voyage of discovery. He entered Pamlico Sound and explored the coast northward. The Queen bestowed upon this whole region the name of Virginia. Among the discoveries of minor importance made toward the close of the 16th century were those of Bartholomew Gosnold, the Englishman. In a voyage to Virginia, as the whole coast was then called, he discovered and named Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Elizabeth Island. He attempted to form a settlement on the latter, but without success. Chapter 10. Settlement at Jamestown. We must now leave the general current of events in America and turn our attention particularly to the settlement and progress of our own country, the United States. While the Spaniards, Portuguese, French, and other nations were carrying out the New World to suit themselves, We must now consider the operations of the English in North America. But as our attention will first be directed to the southern section of our country, let us study the map at page 24. It says it's a map of the states, southern states. You have Florida down here, Mexico, and then it has over here Alabama, Black Warrior River, Tennessee River, Kentucky, Ohio, and then it goes up through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. It has Fredericksburg right there. It lists out Annapolis, Norfolk, Edenton, Atlantic Ocean. This is right here is Chattahoochee River. It lists Pensacola. Somewhat familiar. This presents us with a view of the southern states as we now appear. We shall here see divisions of the states and locations of towns which did not exist at the time at which our history commences. The mountains, rivers, shores, and waters were, however, the same. 115 years pass away after the discovery of America by Columbus, and 110 after the discovery of the continent by the Cabots, and no permanent settlement had yet been effected within the limits of what are now called the United States. But in a new era in the history of this western world was at hand. A company had been formed in England under the patronage of the King James I, whose object was to make settlements anywhere in America between the 34th and 38th degree of north latitude, or what it was called South Virginia. For this purpose they obtained a royal grant or patent. In May 1607, a colony of 105 persons under the direction of this company arrived off the coast of South Virginia. Their first intention had been to form a settlement on Roanoke Island, but being driven farther to the north in a violent storm, they discovered and entered the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. To the capes of this bay in passing, they gave the names they now bear, Cape Charles, Cape Henry, in honor of the two sons of their king, to a point of land farther within the mouth of the bay and near where Hampton now stands. They gave the name of Point Comfort on account of the comfortable anchorage they found there. This first body of emigrants, unfortunately, did not consist of families of hardy enterprising farmers and other laborers and mechanics. There were only 12 laborers and a few mechanics in the company, 48 gentlemen to 4 mechanics, as the historians inform us. All, moreover, were single men, not an organized family being among them. They were commanded by Captain Christopher Newport, an old and experienced navigator. After smoking the culmet or pipe of the peace with the natives on the spot where Hampton now stands, they proceeded slowly up the river, which in honor of their king they called the James. But although they began by smoking the pipe of peace, it appears that some of the savage tribes, as they ascended the river, showed signs of hostility. They had doubtless heard of the treatment of their brethren at the Roanoke River 20 years before, which will be mentioned in the history of North Carolina, or at least of the kidnappers of 1520. At length the colonists came to a peninsula some 50 miles up the river on its northern side, which they selected as a suitable place to which to establish themselves. Here they landed and went to work. The place was called Jamestown. It was now about the middle of May, and this says building houses at Jamestown. The plan of government for their little colony had been prepared for them before they left England. One of their first efforts was to ratify, as if it were, this constitution or form of government. It consisted of a council or board of 7 persons from whom they were selected. A president was to act as their chief magistrate. We must now omit the notice the method of forming this first United States government. The London Company had selected the council before the immigrants set out, but the names were carefully put in a box and concealed till the party should arrive in Virginia. They were then to open it and organize themselves. A code of laws, which had also been prepared by the company, was to be at the same time promulgated. The names of 7 counselors were Bartholomew Gosnold, the navigator, John Smith, Edward Wingfield, Christopher Newport, John Radcliffe, John Martin, and George Kendall. They made choices of Mr. Wingfield for their president. And I think we'll stop there today and begin next time with Chapter 11, The Weakness of the Colony. Thanks for joining me as I take a look at history as we go back in time with our old books. And thanks for watching Old Book Time Traveler. Please leave us a comment, like it, and share. And of course subscribe if you're interested in listening to old books to take you back in time.